Every year since her son went missing, Emily Johnson never stopped returning to the woods on the outskirts of town. That was the trail where, 11 years ago, her little boy, Ethan, only 7 years old, vanished without a trace. She knew plenty of people called her crazy for still searching, but she didn't care. While there was even a sliver of hope, she would always come back. Get ready for this heartfelt story. On that afternoon, every step she took made the crunch of dry leaves under her boots sound louder than usual. The air felt frozen in time, and the forest, normally alive with birdsong, was wrapped in an eerie silence. When she reached the clearing where Ethan had disappeared, Emily knelt down and placed a small toy car on the ground, a replica of Ethan's favorite, a yearly gesture of love and remembrance. With tears threatening to spill over, she whispered, "Happy birthday, my love," while scanning the area, feeling a shiver run down her spine. The woods seemed denser than before, the trees leaning in as if watching her every move. Suddenly, something moved at the edge of the clearing. Her heart raced as her eyes fixed on a shadow between the trunks. "Is anyone there?" she called out hesitantly. A rustling of leaves replied, and slowly a figure emerged from the darkness, a tall, thin young man in ragged, dirty clothes. His face was pale, his hair disheveled, but it was his striking blue eyes that made Emily's world stop. She recognized those eyes all too well. Breath caught in her throat. "Ethan," she managed to ask. The young man stood motionless, staring at her with an unreadable expression. "Ethan," she repeated, her voice trembling. After a pause, in a hoarse tone, as if unused for years, he said, "I lost my way." Emily's legs weakened as everything around her faded. The chill of the autumn air, the scent of damp earth, even the sound of her own quickened breathing. There was no one but him. "Oh my God," she murmured. Moving slowly toward her, she asked, "Are you alive?" She longed to hug him, to feel his warmth, to believe that this really was her son, but something felt off. His familiar eyes were empty, as if something vital had been stripped away. "Where have you been?" she asked, trying to hold back her tears. Ethan's gaze shifted away, and that's when Emily noticed another presence. Turning slowly, she saw a figure emerging from the shadows between the trees. A lean, tall man with worn-out clothes, messy hair, and an intense, somber look. Her heart froze. It was Daniel, the man who had once been her husband and who had vanished shortly after Ethan's disappearance. Daniel barely managed a word, stopping next to his son and staring at her without expression. "What happened to you both?" she whispered, her mind spinning. Daniel exchanged a glance with Ethan before answering in a low, rough voice, "We got lost." "Lost?" Emily echoed, the anguish growing inside her. Daniel nodded and continued. "At first, we tried to go back, but the forest embraced us. We met other people and, over time, realized this was our new home." Emily stepped back, a lump forming in her throat. "So you mean you've been living here all along?" Daniel hesitated before replying, "Not just here, beyond here." Those words sent a chill down her spine. "And Ethan, darling, do you want to come home with me?" For a moment, the young man's eyes locked on hers, a flicker of hesitation passing through his gaze. But before he could answer, Daniel rested a hand on his shoulder and calmly said, "He belongs to the forest now." "We both do." Emily's heart pounded in disbelief. "This is insane. You've held our son captive here," she exclaimed. Daniel sighed and shook his head. "You don't understand, Emily. We found a new way of living." Rage boiled inside her. "No, this isn't a home. This is a cult, isn't it? You let yourself get caught up in some madness and dragged our son along." Daniel's face remained impassive. "It isn't a cult," he said flatly. "It's something bigger." Fear welled up in Emily. "What did you do to my son?" The silence that followed was deafening. "Finally," Daniel answered softly, though his tone was heavy with an emotion Emily couldn't quite decipher. "The forest changed us." That's when Emily noticed something was terribly wrong with Ethan. It wasn't just the scars or marks. It was the way he'd freeze, as if his eyes were seeing something invisible to her. At that moment, she also realized that the sound around her weren't just the forest silence anymore. There were now small whispers and subtle movements among the trees. Emily spun around and saw shadows, people emerging from the darkness, approaching slowly. Their faces were grimy, their clothes old and tattered, and their eyes glowed in the dark, just like Ethan's. "Who are these people?" she asked, her voice faltering. Daniel glanced at the figures before returning his gaze to Emily. "There are those who chose to remain in the forest." The woods seemed to close in around her as her heart pounded so loudly she could almost hear it. She looked back at Ethan, desperation taking over. "Honey, do you want to stay?" Ethan hesitated before answering softly. No, his response filled her with hope. She reached out, saying, "Come with me now." But Daniel grabbed the boy's shoulder even tighter. "You know you can't leave," he said in a low yet firm tone. For the first time, fear flashed in Ethan's eyes, and that was enough for Emily to act. Without thinking, she lunged forward and grabbed Ethan's arm, pulling him hard. But Daniel was quicker. He clutched Ethan's wrist tightly. "Don't do this, Emily," he warned. Still, she refused to let go, pulling with all her strength as the whispers grew louder and the shadows shifted, surrounding them. Emily felt cold sweat trickle down her neck, her heart pounding as if it might burst. Daniel's grip was as unyielding as a shackle. She screamed, struggling to break free. Daniel looked at her with an expression that bordered on pity. "You don't understand," he murmured. "The forest changed us. It made us a part of it." A shiver ran through Emily. "This is madness. You're not part of anything. You're just human. Ethan is my son." Ethan looked at her, and she saw an inner battle in his eyes, as if he were trying to recall something long forgotten. "Mom," he whispered, and that single word gave Emily the strength to act. With a sudden burst, she dug her nails into Daniel's arm and shoved him back with all her might. He stumbled, surprised by her reaction. Without wasting another second, Emily grabbed Ethan's wrist and began to run. The sound of footsteps echoed behind them as the forest seemed to come alive, the whispers rising and mingling with the rustling wind. Shadows moved and gleaming eyes appeared in the darkness, but Emily didn't stop. She knew that trail like the back of her hand, and she was sure of the way out. If they could reach the forest's edge, they'd be safe. "Mom, Ethan," the boy cried, his voice trembling with fear. Emily squeezed his hand. "Run, sweetheart, run." The steps behind them quickened, and the shadows grew ever closer. She dared not look back. Suddenly, a break in the trees appeared, a glimmer of light that signaled the exit. With one last burst of energy, she pulled Ethan and dashed out of the forest. The cool night air hit her skin as silence fell over them. She stumbled, falling to her knees on the dirt road, breathing hard and trembling all over. Ethan, equally out of breath, stood by her side. They had made it. They were out. Emily hugged her son tightly, feeling the chill of his skin against hers. "Are you okay?" she asked, gently cradling his face. Ethan met her gaze, and then he smiled, a small, peculiar smile. A shiver ran down her spine. Ethan tilted his head slightly and, still smiling, murmured, "The forest never lets anyone truly leave, Mom." Behind them, in the dark of the woods, a sound echoed, a whisper, a laugh. The forest was alive and never really let anyone go. Emily felt her blood run cold as she sensed the world around her unravel while a muffled laugh echoed through the trees. Ethan stood frozen before her, his smile unwavering. "What do you mean by that, darling?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ethan hesitated before replying. His blue eyes, once so full of life, now reflected something that Emily couldn't quite grasp, something deep, something ancient. "The forest chose us," he finally said in a calm, almost hypnotic tone. Emily stepped back, desperate to pull him away. "That can't be true," she countered. "You're with me now. You're safe, Ethan." The boy blinked slowly, repeating the word safe, as if he didn't quite understand its meaning. "But safety isn't out there, Mom." Emily held his face firmly, trying to bring him back to reality. "We're home now. You'll remember soon. Let's go back, and everything will be all right." For a brief moment, Ethan's smile faltered, his eyes brightening as if something inside him was fighting to reawaken. Then he blinked again, his expression growing distant. "I can never truly leave, Mom," he said softly. Emily felt her heart sink. "Of course you can. You're here with me." Ethan tilted his head, studying her as if trying to understand something fragile. "But what if I'm not the same anymore?" he asked, his stomach churning. "What do you mean by that?" he continued, stepping back and pulling away from her touch. "The forest changes us. It molds us and always calls us back." Those words froze the air around Emily. It was then that she realized the forest hadn't been left behind. The silence wasn't natural at all. She sensed something was watching, not just one pair of eyes, but several shadows at the edge of the woods that seemed darker, as if the forest itself had grown, swallowing the space between them and the town. The whispers began again, low and dragging, words she couldn't decipher but knew were meant for her. Gripping Ethan's wrist even tighter than before, Emily said, "Let's get out of here now." For a moment, the boy hesitated, but then something shifted behind him. The whispers intensified, and Ethan smiled once more. This time a bigger, slow, almost reverent smile. "Mom," he whispered, "they're calling." Terror surged through every fiber of Emily's being. "No," she shouted, pulling him even harder. But something in his eyes had changed, something that no longer looked like the son she knew. "I have to go back," he said, and desperation overwhelmed her. "Ethan, no. You're with me. You don't need to go back." Yet the whispers turned louder, the shadows shifted, and the forest seemed to come alive, determined to keep Ethan. His hand slipped from hers, and in an instant he stepped back. Emily screamed and tried to grab him, but before she could reach him, the boy vanished into the dark embrace of the forest. "No, Ethan," she cried, chasing after him through the trees, ignoring the feeling of the woods closing in around her. But it was too late. The forest had claimed him. Ethan disappeared among the shadows. The whispers fell silent, and the stillness returned, leaving Emily alone for what felt like an eternity. There she stood, rooted in place, staring into the dense darkness where her son had just vanished once again. Her breaths came in ragged gasps. Panic, pain, and fury swirled inside her. She knew that if she stepped back into the forest, she might never come out again. Yet she also knew she'd never stop trying. She would always come back, because as long as there was even the tiniest chance, Ethan could still be saved, even if the forest never let anyone truly leave. What do you think of Emily's choice? Could you have left the woods after everything that happened? And if you were in Ethan's shoes, what would you do? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you felt moved by this story, please like and share with your friends, and subscribe for more updates. See you next time.